Okay. Just want to take a moment to talk a little bit about being in the right place at the right time. I read some things this week. There was this traveling salesman. He holed up in a hotel in Chicago that happened to have a doctor's convention there. So there were doctors and nurses all over this hotel, and he went out to the lobby to go out, and he collapsed in the lobby and had a heart attack. And I guess if you're going to have a heart attack and you're not in a hospital, the best place you can be perhaps is in a room full of doctors and nurses. And they were able to sustain him until the paramedics could get him to the hospital, and he survived the situation. I think that's kind of an example of being in the right place at the right time. And, you know, this week is 9/11, and there's celebrations and remembrances starting even now this week, leading up to it. And I read some things this week about 9/11, and there was like, 2,300 people that lost their lives when those towers collapsed. And but there were stories about people who should have been there but weren't there. And there's about 8 of them here. There was a head of a company who was supposed to be in the tower that day, but his son had to go to kindergarten. His wife couldn't take him, so that morning he ended up not going to work that day. It was late because he took his son to kindergarten. You know, there's another lady that was thinking about her coworkers, and before she got to the tower, she stopped to buy some donuts, and she missed being there at that point in time. There was a woman whose alarm clock didn't go off, and she was late for work, fortunately for her situation. Another one came from New Jersey and was stuck on the Jersey Turnpike going through the tunnel and got delayed at the same time in that situation. One missed the bus, and another one spilled food on her clothes, and then she had to stop and change her clothes, and this put her back a little bit in her timing. Another one's car wouldn't start. Another one stopped to answer his house phone, and just in those minutes or so was enough to have him delayed being there. Another one had bought new shoes, developed blisters on their feet, and had to stop at a drugstore to get some Band-Aids so they wouldn't have pain all day. All these things, you know, when those things happen to us, I mean, it's happened to all of us. We get on the road, you know, we got to go somewhere, and you're a little bit late, and you get on the highway and you get to a point on the freeway where there's a tremendous accident, and you drive by it and you say, but for the grace of God go I. You know, had I not been late, I may have been one of those cars that were in that tragedy and accident. It happens all the time, you know, and we get annoyed and we get frustrated and we get angry when those kind of things happen. You know, we try to get things back to normal again. And you know, one of the things we might say, we're lucky. You know, I got a brother-in-law who likes to ride motorcycles. And when he lived in Phoenix, he got hit by a car, and he was laying in the street, and the tires of this truck missed his head by about 3 inches. And he claims that was luck. Look, these people in 9/11, they say they were lucky that those delays happened. You know, there's no luck in those situations. It's not a coincidence or something like that. You know, it's the fact that God, in His infinite wisdom and according to His plan, you know, He positions us in positions and places that's sometimes inconvenient to us, but it's part of His divine plan. And I don't know if we even stop to think about that enough sometimes. I know I don't, because I got a short fuse. You know, when things don't go right for me, my wife is nodding over here. We'll talk about that at home. But later on, you know, I look at it and I say, you know, I need to think a little bit more about, you know, God being in all of this stuff, you know, that there's no coincidences, there's no accident, there's not luck sometimes. It's the fact that God, by his divine strength and his plan, he orchestrates a current situation for us to be part of his purpose. And, we just get busy. We maybe just don't even pay attention to the fact that I'm delayed or my plan changed, because of this or because of that. Maybe we need to start putting ourselves in perspective that my plan changed because God wants me to be in a different place at a different time. And if we kind of start to get that mindset that God's controlling our life and where we're at and where we need to be, and where we should be, maybe we could not be as frustrated or as annoyed when these situations occur to us and anything like that. I looked at four particular events or four particular situations about, God being directing our life in whatever way that he sees fit. That God does orchestrate our steps according to his plan. And there's a couple examples here that I can show here. One is in Esther, and I understand that Sloan and Ellie here have just studied Esther last week. Is that right, girls? So they could probably tell you this story. But Esther, she was in the Persian Empire, and it says here from about 484 to 456 BC is when she lived. And she was a young Jewish woman that was orphaned. And she lived with her cousin, a guy named Mordecai. And Mordecai was the fellow that it says sat in the king's court. He had some kind of role to play. He was a Jewish fella. She was Jewish. And they were under King, what is his name? Ahasuerus, it was his name. And things were different in those days. The king was married to a lady named Vashti, and she one day was beckoned by the king to come to his throne room or whatever, and she refused to do that. And in those days, if you refuse whatever the king wanted to do, he took care of you. So he divorced her. But, his eye fell upon Esther, who was in the court. He didn't know that she was Jewish. He just saw that she was a beautiful young lady, and he liked her, and he ended up marrying her. She became the queen. And the king had this guy that was named Haman, who was like the boss of everybody. I don't know what you call him, but he kind of like was the captain of everything in the court. And Mordecai, Esther's cousin, one day Haman put out a decree that everyone who was going to bow down to him. In those days they did things like that. For whatever reasons we don't know, but Mordecai was not going to do that. And as a result of that, Haman's decree was that he wanted to kill all the Jews, because of that disobedient position that Mordecai took. And, Mordecai heard about this and was concerned that all the Jews were going to be killed because of Haman's decree. So he went to his cousin, who now is the queen, and said, you need to approach the king to tell him that this guy Haman's a little off base. He shouldn't be doing this stuff. And it's, the fate of the Jewish people are at your hands. And, she did something very bold, because where the previous queen, Vashti, she got set aside because she didn't come when the king called her. In this particular case, you weren't supposed to go to the king until he called you. But Esther, based upon the fear that the Jewish people were having at that point in time, she went to the king, which you're supposed to do that either. But the king forgave her in that situation, and he set out the decree that, Haman, you're not right. You're not going to kill the Jewish people because of that. So Esther, in a long story, say here, she was in the right place at the right time to prevent that tragedy from happening. In fact, Mordecai says, who knows whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And I think about that in our lives. Sometimes our plans get diverted somehow. Sometimes we find ourselves in places that we would have never even thought about or planned on in any shape or way or form. And I wonder, do we ever think about, why is God putting us here at this point in time? Is there a role that I'm supposed to be playing in God's vast plan that says I'm supposed to be here at this point in time to what? Bear a testimony, say a prayer, whatever it might be. She just made a plea here to the king, and the king decided, you know what, that decree of Haman's is off base, and it saved all the Jewish people. You go to the Book of Mormon, and Lehi's taken his family away from Jerusalem, and they're out in the wilderness there. And before they go any further, Lehi says to his boys, we can't go any further. We need to get the plates from Laban, because it's the history of our people. And, it's got to be the continuity of where we go from here that we have to maintain, so everybody understands where we came from and what God's done in our life. So he sends the boys back, and they have some trouble. I think it was, 3, maybe 4 times? I'm not sure. Their plans get, delayed. They can't make it, but, Nephi has the Spirit of the Lord in him. He doesn't understand why he's out there in the wilderness to begin with, but he believes in the experience his dad had, and he believes in the expectation that his dad gave him to go get those plates. So he's out there with the other brothers, and he says, and I was led by the Spirit, not knowing beforehand the things which I should do. He was in the right place at the right time. Still didn't know what to do, but he knew that God was telling him, you got to go do this. And as you read the rest of the story there, he found a way to have Laban killed, or kill Laban, and get those plates and go on with the journey. He's in the right place at the right time, and he succumbed to the will of the Lord. So that's what I say about the rest of us. Sometimes we got to kind of just figure out where we're at and why. But maybe even before that we need to kind of put our convictions in a spot where the Lord can kind of convince us that this is why I'm here and this is what I got to do. Because sometimes I think our mind gets cluttered with our thoughts and our plans and what we think we should do at every point in time. So not only does God kind of set us forth in paths that he wants us to be, but he wants us to be ready when he calls us to do that. And then there's a story in Acts with Philip and a eunuch. And it says that Philip was led by the Spirit to approach this Ethiopian on the road, and that he obeyed. And with his Spirit, he was in the right place at the right time with the Spirit that the Lord gave him, and he was able to provide scriptures and stories to this Ethiopian eunuch to convert him to Christ. Now, I don't know if that was a conscious thought that Philip had when he went out to it, but he allowed himself to be led by the Spirit. And I think that's what I'm trying to say for all of us. Sometimes we got to give up our own particular will and allow ourselves to, when we find ourselves kind of over here instead of being over there, why am I here? Well, is this a purpose for the Lord that I'm over here now instead of over there? And if so, I need to open my mind enough to say, Lord, give me some direction. Give me some insight. What am I supposed to do here? Where am I supposed to go? Book of Mormon tells us about Ammon and King Lamoni. It says he happened to meet King Lamoni's servants at this pool of Shebus, it's called. And it says, because he was faithful and obedient, he led the entire conversion of an entire kingdom come to the Lord, because he succumbed to the fact that he was in this place at that time, and the Lord says, this is what you need to do for me. So it's not only a matter of being in the right place at the right time physically, geographically, it's being at the right place at the right time with a spiritual mindset. Be opened up to let the Lord tell us what we've got to do while we're here in this particular place. And not only being in the right place at the right time, there's dangers of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that example's in the Old Testament with the with our good friend David. David had a lot of ups and downs. David, he was always able to kind of recover from the mistakes he made out of passion, out of whatever drove him to do it. But there was an example here of him being in the wrong place at the wrong time. There was a battle going on, and David happened to look upon Bathsheba and liked her and decided that he wanted her for his own, and she is married. So he sends her husband out to the battlefield to get him out of the way so he could entertain and have Bathsheba to himself. And it was said here in 2 Samuel, it was at the time when the kings go forth to battle that David tarried still at Jerusalem. He remained in the wrong place at the wrong time for the wrong motive in that situation. And sometimes when that happens to us, we fall to temptation. We kind of lose track of where we're at, and we don't really allow ourselves the opportunity to have the Lord direct us in terms of what we need to do. We decide on our own that this is the decision that I want to make, and I'm going to make that decision now. And oftentimes, because of that, we fall in some kind of a disrepair, if you will, and some discontent. Now, it's always trusting in God's timing is we've got to do. He leads us in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake, in a prayer that he taught everybody, to be at the right place at the right time for his name's sake. And it's God's timing that lets things happen. The best example of God's timing, I can say, is Joseph of Egypt. This young guy, was a victim of some unfair treatment by his brothers who were jealous of him. But Joseph, had it within his heart and his mind, and he was spiritually grounded in terms of what the Lord's purpose was in his life. And I'm not saying that he was comfortable with the circumstances he found himself in. I mean, his brothers took him out, and first they were going to kill him, and then they had a second thought, and they threw him in a pit, and then he gets picked up out of the pit, and he becomes a prisoner and a slave, and he gets disappointed so many times where he helps other people out of their particular circumstances, and he just merely says, when you get to see the king, please remember me, for doing this for you, and they ignore that. So he's all alone for years. I don't know how long it took. But then it gets to a point where he becomes a favorite son within the king's house, and he's over it all, right? And his brothers come to him. Those very same brothers who dumped him in the pit years ago. Now at this time, they're in desperate need of some help. There was a famine in the land. They didn't have any food. And here's this brother of theirs, which they didn't totally recognize at first. He says, but as for you, he says to his brothers, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. God's time. And that's, I think, one of our biggest frustrations. We just had fast and prayer here just a moment ago, and we prayed for a lot of needs that we all have. And then we step back, and you know what? I'm still sick. I still have the affliction. I still have the tension or the contention in my life and all that. We have a situation in our family, and I've said this before, my grandson and my granddaughter-in-law, have this beautiful little baby boy, and for whatever reason, my grandson is boycotted his mom. It's going to be a year next Saturday, a year that he's not done anything with her. That little baby's almost 10 months old now. She's only seen him 4 times. And Carrie and I pray every night, Lord, what can you do about this situation? We read about hard hearts in the Book of Mormon, Laman and Lemuel and that group. I mean, the Lord even came down and shook them physically, and it wasn't enough to move them to soften their hearts to follow the Lord. And so we talk about God's timing. Lord, come on. We've been praying for a year, for goodness sake. The situation still exists. I got to remember Joseph here. Maybe you do too, that sometimes God's timing is not exactly in line with our timing, but but we cannot give up the hope. We cannot give up the promise that he's not going to forsake us, that he will at some point in his time, have an answer to the prayers that we have, and we could see the blessings and how it works in this situation. So we have to stay the course, don't we? I mean, it would be so tempting for us to kind of move from this place over to here into that place to say, you know what, I'm done, God. I'm not waiting anymore. I'm going to take this on my own and do something like that. And that's the kind of world we live in today, too. As we leave God behind, everybody wants to take things in their own hands to take care of it. And what do you get out of that? You get nothing but chaos, and you still don't have the need that you have to get answered in that situation. Trusting in God's timing, I guess, is an ultimate situation. Last night, Carrie and I sometimes, because we're two old people and don't have much else to do, we started to been watching YouTube channel, not YouTube TV, but the YouTube channel. And if you've done that, it's pretty enlightening. They got a lot of little short snippets of things. A lot of it's spiritual. A lot of it's about God. And last night, we found this little clip with this comedian named Jeff Foxworthy. You might have heard him. He's this redneck comedian, right? He's known for that humor. Well, he was speaking to a Christian group about how the Lord works in your life. And he was at this convention, and it was for homeless people. And he met this guy who invited him to come down to Atlanta and to speak to this group of homeless men. And he said, I'll go. People ask me to do fundraisers or things for him because he's, got some fame. So he went and he started listening to these homeless guys talk about their story. And he said that he met this one guy named Jesse, big guy, he says, was a huge fellow. And he looked like a mess. And he was asking these people, he asked Jesse, he says, what made you homeless? Why are you in this condition? And he said, well, when I was like 11 years old, he says, my mother committed suicide. And then I had a brother, and I was about 15 years old. My brother committed suicide. And then I'm a young man, I'm living with my dad, and my dad commits suicide. He said, I'm a mess. I was a mess at that time. I had no confidence, no faith, no nothing in anything. I'm alone now. And he said, well, one of the things that I got out of that was my dad had a $70,000 insurance policy, and that was the most money I've ever seen in my life. So I'm alone. I've got no direction, and I got $70,000. So he says, you know what I did? I went out and I bought all the cocaine I could get, and I got high. And what happens when you get on a habit like that? You miss going to work. So in 2 weeks, I lost my job. I had no income, but I still had a hunk of the $70,000 yet. That I had two girlfriends. So I had two girlfriends, and I had cocaine, and I didn't need anything else until he said the money ran out. And then my two girlfriends left me the very next day, and I'm all alone again. And since I didn't have a job, I couldn't pay my rent. Now I'm on the street. That's how I got homeless. And he says, but before that happened, he said, I remember that when my mother died, she left me a Bible, and she left me a note in the front of that Bible. And it talked about how, you'll never be alone as long as you have faith in the Lord, and it's just stay the course with that. He says, I threw that Bible away with everything else that I didn't have anymore. And I never thought about it again. He says, but so I'm out on the street, and there are places that you see with out in California in particularly, there's meeting places where a lot of the Mexicans just hang out, and people who need laborers and day jobs and stuff like that, they go there and they select 2, 3, 4 guys to go for the day and do whatever they needed to have done in construction or agriculture or whatever. Well, this guy was amongst a group like that. And because he was a big guy, he was noticed. And this dude comes out and says, I need some help moving some things. So I need you and another guy, if you come with me. And he says, yeah, we're gonna do it for the day. So they get in this guy's truck and they drove 100 miles away. And they're in this house that the guy is gonna renovate, but it's full of stuff inside. And he says, we went in there, I had the downstairs, this other guy had the upstairs, and we kind of like moved the stuff around and kind of slid stuff in the corner that we were going to take out to the dump. So I go upstairs, where the other guy's stuff is at, and I see this pile of stuff, and I'm just digging through it to see if there's anything of value that I could sell, from this whole stuff. And he says, I'm digging through, and I look at this old Bible. And he opens it up. And it's his mother's Bible. The note was in it. How many years? How much did that guy go through? Because maybe he didn't adhere to his mother's advice when he was 11 years old. But God doesn't forget you. He put you in a place and a time like that prodigal son, right? He's out there waddling in the pigsty, forgetting everything that his dad had and gave him, went on his own to do his thing. This guy finds this Bible years later, 100 miles from where he was. What are the chances of something like that? We go back to 9/11 and all those people that had some diversions that didn't get them to work on time that day. Was that luck? No, I'll tell you what, that's divine intervention. You look at your life, I look at my life, and I say, why am I in these situations the way it is? I'm so frustrated, I'm so mad, it didn't work out the way I wanted to do. What I don't do, and maybe what you don't do, and maybe what we all should, is stop for a moment and think about, where does God want us to be at this particular time? What's the point? What's the purpose of what we're going to do? No, God's timing is always perfect. Even when our time feels it's delayed, it takes too long, something like that. So I'm going to close by just asking some questions about the application of being in the right place at the right time with God's influence. Am I putting myself in the place that God wants me to be? Do I show up prepared for whatever God wants me to do in that situation? Do I trust God's plan when everything is going crazy around me? Did I firmly put my feet on the ground on that rock of Jesus Christ, and no matter how hard the winds blow? And what did Elijah do, right? In the cave, right? He was fearful that he was going to get killed after he went out there and challenged the prophets of Baal. Found him in this cave, right? Shuddering, saying, Lord, what am I going to do now? Everybody wants to go and kill me now because of what I did. And it says, the Lord appeared, but it wasn't in the wind. And it wasn't in the storm, but it was in that small, still voice that says, you know what? You're in the wrong place here, Elijah. I need you to go back out there again in the right place and trust me in whatever I have to do for you to do my will in your life. Those are questions we got to ask ourselves sometimes. Just stop. Scriptures tell us, be still and know that I'm God. Stop. I'm the worst at that. I react. I kind of go out there on a limb, and only after the fact that I'm out there all by myself do I realize, I got to step back a little bit. I got to reflect upon God in my life, and what does He want me to do? Where does He want me to do? What do I have to do to prepare to be used of God in such a way that I can fulfill His commands for me to do what His will is in my life? Like the man in the hotel room, having been there in the midst of these nurses and doctors, not a coincidence. He was in the right place at the right time with the right people to help him in that situation. Those 9/11 people, again, thank God for the donut shop, right? Thank God it took 15 more minutes because that person could have been on the 97th floor of the tower had that not happened. That traffic jam in the tunnel from New Jersey. How often do we get upset, right? We got this traffic jam and there's this accident that we have to unpile from. But for the grace of God, like I say, that could have been us in that car. No coincidences. There's just divine appointments that the Lord has for us. And, Esther, Nephi, Ammon, Joseph, you know, Alma, they're all placed in situations where God needed them the most to be where they were when they were there. Reflect upon that in our life. Where are we? Does God want me to be here? Am I listening to the fact that, you know, he may not be in the big thunderstorm or in the wind that's blowing around here. He might be in that little small still voice that's telling us, calm down. I got this. Now you got to just do this and all that. You're going to hear it again every Sunday, maybe. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not upon your own understanding. Acknowledge him in all thy ways, and he will direct your paths. He will get you in the right place at the right time, as long as we give up our own selves in that situation. So when the moment comes, we're going to find ourselves exactly where God wants us to be if we put our mindset in that going forward. So I guess that's all I got to say about that. And if you want to just open it up for testimony, God bless you on that. Okay.